Thank you, Dan, for convening all of us. This has sounded like such a fun idea since you proposed it, and in fact, it has been a great deal of fun. I was delighted to get the chance to talk in particular about translation, since interdisciplinary work often feels like translation, right? Speaking across divides and languages into different kinds of audiences, and so I sort of present this work in that light as well. All right, in this essay, I focus on jury instructions as an overlooked aspect of copyright litigation, and sort of surprisingly overlooked. Considering jury instructions as a discursive practice, that is, as an exercise of power through language, highlights the communicative, textual, interpretive, and epistemological features of instructions as they shape civil litigation. I offer two contributions to the conversation on jury instructions, which in the legal academy anyway is extremely deep and wide. There's a ton of literature on jury instructions generally, both civil and criminal, very little on IP, some on patent, but very little on copyright, and very little on copyright and jury instruction sort of at the intersection in the way that I'm thinking. The two contributions I offer are both within the spirit of this symposium's invitation to reflect on the discursive turn. First, I argue that the function of jury instructions can be helpfully illuminated by considering them through some of the concepts and questions drawn from translation theory, which is a term I'm using sort of unfairly to categorize all translation scholarship. And we'll talk more about that because I'm very wary of being someone who kind of goes over and colonizes or extracts from other disciplines, but it is simply such a big body of scholarship that here there would be no way to do true justice to it. So what I'm trying to give you is a bit of a survey of it, and I know I'm cherry picking a little bit. Second, it considers some of the implications of bringing translation theory to bear on jury instructions in the context of copyright litigation. Today I'm going to focus on the first, partly because it seems to me that it's important to talk both about what jury instructions are and to talk about what translation studies are. And that's sort of already a chunk of time. But I will end with a few thoughts about what copyright might learn or benefit from. Okay, so my overview today is as follows. I'll define jury instructions and talk actually for a few minutes about what their purpose is, a little bit about what's been written about them, define translation theory and offer a brief introduction to a few of the schools of thought and movements, and then give you a list of the primary concerns I identify. And you'll see that the way that scholars talk about the problems in jury instructions aligns with many of the things that translation theorists have been thinking about for a century in often very brilliant and diverse and meaningful ways. And then what does this have to do with copyright law? Okay, so what are jury instructions? Well, there's sort of a joke about them, and you see it here. The jury's instructed to ignore common sense, logic, justice, and the big picture, and consider only the minutiae and technical loopholes presented to you by these people who are paid to conceal the truth. And it's a little funny, but actually it's truer than it is funny, which is why it doesn't get a big laugh. But if we think more seriously about what they are, jury instructions, and what they do, they're a set of instructions, both oral and written, given at different stages in the trial. And there are two formal moments, typically preliminary and final jury instructions, but there are also moments of jury interaction throughout the trial that comprise various instructional communications. Now, usually it's after the jury has been seated, but before the opening statements, and then a final set of instructions given at the closing of the evidence. And I find it helpful to mention these things because we don't really teach much about the jury and the jury instructions process in law school, particularly outside of areas like maybe CivPro and criminal law. Their purpose is to help juries find law, to inform them about the procedural and substantive legal issues, to constrain them, including telling them what they can and can't count as evidence and how to weigh it, and then ultimately to focus the trial on the issues. A frequently cited goal for them is to be accurate, impartial, and understandable. But to some extent, these things may actually stand in tension with each other, right? Increasing accuracy sometimes makes jury instructions less understandable. And indeed, the aims of jury instructions sometimes seem to point in different directions. Rather like a fence, they are sometimes intended to discipline juror decision-making and guard against trespass, right? Or a set of orange cones on the road, sort of as warnings. In this sense, they serve the court. On the other hand, they're definitely also designed to aid comprehension and simplify legal concepts, that is, to guide and assist jurors rather like a dictionary and perhaps a map. Both are communicative functions, but where the first is disciplining and directive, the second is expressly translational. It bears meaning or attempts to bear meaning across to those who might not otherwise have access to it. The first might actually also be translational insofar as we have a definition of translation that includes control and violence and sort of imposition. But the second one certainly is, and indisputably so, I think. In explaining this communicative function and promulgating their own set of model civil jury instructions, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals cites both to jurors' duties, in the language that I have on the slide here, and to the goal of increasing juror comprehension. They're intended to give jurors, in understandable language, information to make the trial more meaningful and to permit them to fulfill their duty, and so on. I find this interesting because this is the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals talking about making the trial more meaningful through jury instructions, and indeed, in studying them, they do appear to have a great deal more interpretive significance than one might at first blush think. They speak through the court. They're both through the informal instructions that I mentioned before, and definitely at the end, when as a form of judicial speech, the judge typically produces a final version and reads them, and there are many very interesting accounts by practicing lawyers of sitting in a jury, in a courtroom, listening to a judge and reporting that it's impossible to follow the jury instructions in this area of their substantive expertise, right? And so it's this performance of judicial sort of speech making that's lost on most people. And so it's kind of this interesting performative and not translated, not to say untranslatable, but not translated act. And the judge uses her first-person voice typically, and also interpolates, right? Uses the second person and speaks to the jury, you will do this, you will do that. And these interpolations describe and constitute the jury's collective identity. In fact, they become a modifying clause for the jury, that the jury subsequently picks up. And what I mean by this is you often see in subsequent appellate decisions the modifying clause properly instructed. So the standard for summary judgment, at least one expression of it, is whether a reasonable jury properly instructed could find. Right? So in this sense, the instructions actually become a part of who the jury becomes or has become, even if the fault and responsibility lies with the court. Jury instructions also become tools for jurors to use in their own understanding and storytelling. In their deliberation, jurors may refer back to the jury instructions, sometimes with difficulty or great effort. In one study, and because jury deliberation is normally shielded from view, as you know, these are the studies that discover these things are either mock trials or big jury, long-term jury projects that allow recording of jury deliberation. So in one study, jury deliberation included a complex set of instructions where the jury spontaneously began diagramming sentences on a whiteboard, right? It's like Chomsky, right, in action, to find out what they had to learn so that they could follow the instructions. Some evidence also suggests that jurors use jury instructions in their own persuasive advocacy in jury deliberations, making arguments for the verdict that they believe correct through reliance on jury instructions, right? So talking about the burden of proof or going back to comparative negligence, saying, well, no, we can't actually, we can't include that. Look, this number says we can't do that. Up until this point, I have focused on jury instructions as communications aimed at jurors. And just now, jurors speaking through instructions in some sense. But as their role in the appellate system reflects, jury instructions are also communications from courts to appellate judges, deciding whether lower courts erred in some respect. The standard for review varies by jurisdiction, as I mentioned, but it's generally where the instruction was reasonably correct. So technical errors in the instructions will not be enough for a new trial. It's got to be an error that actually has some meaning, and I talk at length about that in the paper. In the important work that they do, communicating the law to jurors, guiding, constraining them, telling the legal story of a trial, and speaking to subsequent courts, these are an important part of litigation that we haven't grappled with, and certainly not as a discursive genre. There is actually some really interesting rhetorical and genre study-focused work on jury instructions, a small amount of it that I've found, but it's not in the legal academy. That's not to say it's not great, but it would be wonderful to see a kind of more of a convergence. Now, to turn briefly to what's been written about it, jury scholarship has ranged far and wide methodologically, and I'm happy to talk about it more if there's time afterwards or in subsequent conversations. It's tackled the problems associated with jury decision-making at the level of the individual, so psychological issues, biases, nullification resistance, and so forth. At the jury level, so the group, the collective dynamic, and at the system of the larger, at the level of the larger system. It has done so with an eye on many different kinds of topics, thank you, but I'm going to focus on translation-relevant ones so that I can show you some of the overlap. So it has done so with an eye on psychology, language processing, and linguistic theories of communication, so plain meaning and so forth. But as far as I'm aware, without any recourse to the deep body of translation scholarship, which provides insights into the very kinds of meaning-making at the heart of the jury's operation. And if you know of such work, I'd love to know of it, because I've been on a hunt for it for a while. I just really haven't turned it up. Okay. It's especially interesting to think about translation because on the jury instruction scholarship side, there's a very widespread understanding that law possesses a particular kind of language, and we can debate, where's Simon, that we can debate how technical it is, thank you for that reference, and we can debate what it requires, but in general, especially those who are studying jury instructions agree that jury instructions don't usually work. They have made some reforms, they've gotten us somewhat better, but the comprehension level of them is still pretty bad, and there's something ritualistic about that reading of them that suggests we're committed to retaining them in this form in some way or another, in spite of the fact that they don't work. So let's talk about that for a moment. Why, oops. What have I done? Thank you. So the problems with jury instructions, a whole bunch of different kinds of problems. I'm going to focus on two. They're complex and they're misunderstood. In a recent experiment, an antitrust lawyer took the jury instructions from an antitrust case and tested them for comprehension difficulty using the Flesch Reading Ease test, a tool designed, as its name implies, to rate texts for how hard they are to understand. On a rating of 0 to 100, where 100 was the easiest, Moby Dick got a 57.9, fairly difficult. War and Peace scored a 68.6, standard. And these jury instructions were rated 41.6, difficult. The jury instructions were deemed to require 15.3 years of education, equivalent to, in the United States, high school plus over 3 years of college, just to understand, right? And this is a basic function that we're expecting our jurors to be able to do. Attempts to improve jury instructions explicitly tackle the question in terms of the foreignness of the language. Plain English seeks to make legal terms understandable to a lay person by removing legalese, and I'm quoting here, which is characterized by technical vocabulary, archaic, formal, and unusual words, impersonal constructions, overuse of nominalizations and passives, overuse of modal verbs, multiple negations, long and complex sentences, and poor organization. You see from this effort to simplify, now it's me, my voice, from legal English to lay English, that although there is technically no foreign language in the jury context, there is a kind of language barrier nonetheless. And this brings me to translation theory. Now, at a very basic level, 10,000 feet up, translation theory concerns situations in which there is a source text or source set of practices or texts and a target text. Broadly, it's concerned with the interrelationship of these two things. Some linguistic barrier or intralinguistic or interlinguistic or semiotic barrier, sometimes cultural, temporal, and epistemological barriers as well. Translation theory helps theorize a bunch of different things here. It helps theorize the source text and its transmission through time and language, its production. It can focus on the target text and what its purpose is. Why translation is needed will condition to some extent what sorts of translation, what frameworks for translation, and how it's conceptualized. And it helps us think too about interrelationships. There's wonderful work in translation theory on theories of the part and the whole, and what role metaphor and symbolic thinking has. It's also really good for a question that concerns us, which is to say questions of commensurability and incommensurability and things that can't be translated or that when you translate them, you change them in some way. It's also a powerful way to talk about violence and the sorts of violence and rupture that are done when carrying one thing from another. And lastly, I'll say that in the colonial and post-colonial context, translation is often associated with trickery or fraud or violence, and I don't think that's irrelevant in the context with jury instructions, right, where lawyers are dueling to get something sort of passed over to the jury and to sort of control and persuade. Now, one view of translation holds that it is and must be rooted in the science of language and psychology. You see here a reference to translation as a technology. And on this view, there's no one consensus, of course. This is a very big field, but you find many scholars who align with the view that function or impact on listeners is of primary importance. How does the work land? How is it heard in the original? And we're studying that set of processes. The answer to what constitutes a good translation, in other words, is how to produce the same effect in the listener in the target language. Now, there's a competing view that the best translations, even within this sphere, are the most accurate ones, where accurate means technically accurate. Now, some argue that technical accuracy must be at the level of the word, or at the level of the sentence, or at the level of the chapter or the text, right? There are all sorts of debates about that. And there's, in fact, a debate about whether foreignizing or fluency is the proper goal. Thank you. So if you carry something over and it still feels foreign or stilted or awkward, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And that kind of depends on your view of translation as well as what you're trying to do with the source, the target text. Then there's a view that's more like art, in the science versus art, to double down on that binarism. And that's that with using the accuracy approach, you might end up with a really bad text. Like, it might be accurate, and you might find, as Nabokov has here, shorn of its primary verbal existence, the original text will not be able to soar and to sing, but it can be very nicely dissected and mounted and scientifically studied in all its organic details. And he's talking here about the madness of trying to translate Eugene Onegin, or Evgeny. I'm like, would you say one in English and the other in Russian? That's so pretentious. But anyhow, so there's this constant tension in the translation scholarship between science and sometimes scientistic, sort of put down versions of translation versus art. Now, there are many diverse disciplines represented in translation theory and many offshoots, and the offshoots track the various kinds of things we've seen in literature, film studies. Cultural studies is a highly contested subfield of translation studies, and there are many different modes. So I think that there's a rich body of work from which people interested in going and reading more in it could learn, and I don't see that happening. So I hope that this will be sort of a consciousness raising where we can go take a look at that literature. I've mentioned already two of the central issues for translation theory, and one is the impulsion towards accuracy versus equivalence, how it lands. There are also some very interesting issues regarding how to translate something over into a culture that doesn't understand it or doesn't have an equivalent function. And then I've ended down at the bottom with a few instances of words or concepts that are either untranslatable or that, when carried over, create nonsense or a mistake. I've just quickly flashed through some of the key mistakes or problems in jury instructions that I mentioned earlier, and you can see that these things bear directly or could be borne directly on by translation theory. Okay, now this is one of my favorite examples. If you ever studied Arabic, you know that this is an example from the Hans Wehr dictionary that we all love to make fun of, but the word Amariya means camel-born sedan and the virgin riding it into battle. It's axiomatic about translation that translations are longer and unwieldier than the original, which suggests that there are certain things that we have to wrestle with when we're porting things over. And here, this example gives you not just the short long, but the complete conceptual nonsense, right, of talking to somebody about this and being like, oh yeah, I have a camel, and they're like, what are you talking about, right? There's a temporal issue, a cultural issue. Here's another problem. Calques or cognates, false friends. The example that I give is the marché aux puces, which in French is the flea market. And if you were trying to describe that literally and port the words over, you would say the flea market or the market of fleas. But that wouldn't have the same meaning. You wouldn't understand it, right? And then if you tried to dissuade somebody from understanding it and thinking that it was a flea-filled market, you would say, no, it's the market without the fleas. No, it's not a market with fleas, you know. And the circumlocution simply to dissuade somebody that they're not thinking what they think they know it means, right? That's the problem with false friends. Another good example is embarazada. If you tell somebody in Spanish you're embarazada and you think that you're saying you're embarrassed and actually you're saying you're pregnant, it just has a different meaning, right? So it tricks you. Okay, the problem is copyright is based on a whole series of calcs. So one of the primary issues that we're going to struggle with as we think about how to improve jury instructions in copyright is this issue of disabusing jurors of the notion that they already know what they need to know. Because unlike patent, right, it's not a complex area, and so there's already, and this is something Rebecca Tushant has talked about, there's already a misperception about that. And this, by the way, is a point that Betsy Rosenblatt made implicitly earlier when she was talking about original doesn't mean the thing that we think it means. There are also other issues like scope, and we've seen this in a bunch of recent big trials, the blurred lines litigation, the Oracle v. Google litigation where the jury instructions were fought over and back and forth and months, and then actually on remand. I mean, that was one of the central issues. But if jurors can't actually do the work we're asking them to do by hearing what's protectable or understanding what an API is, and we're assuming that they can do it, then that's a problem, and that's particular and difficult to instruct around. I haven't talked about this one at all, so we'll see if there's a chance to raise it in questions. But in brief, and I'll just wrap it up because I see Dan giving me the look. The word plagiarism was used historically through copyright, and it's still sometimes used, especially in the old cases. It is a calc, it does not mean what you think it means, and also it conveys a false sense to jurors that copying is wrongful, and we all know that that's not true, but jurors don't. It's a very hard thing to dislodge that, and that might also be a sign of its untranslatability. Okay, thank you very much.
Obviously, I have trouble with technology, but there's also, it's a real pleasure to then have a chance to respond to Sarah's talk. I just want to say quickly, there was a little translation from the written presentation that I'm responding to the oral one, obviously, as everyone knows that. I hope that will be, so I'm going to say certain things that you guys didn't hear, but that will just, since she didn't have enough time to present her whole paper, give some of the other objects. So the task of the jury instructor, and she's, as she says, applying translation theory to jury instructions in copyright litigation, but jury instructions in general also. And her title, is, in case anyone missed it, is an allusion to Benjamin's The Task of the Translator. I'm actually going to a little later comment on the move from an instructor to a translator, that translation, since I think there's somewhat difference. She began, from what I had, was addressing certain possible objections. So she didn't quite do this in the talk, but they were there implicit, and so I'm just going to go, oh, no, I did the same thing. Jesus. I think my thumb is hitting the wrong thing. So the first objection is obvious. There's no foreign language involved. But as she says, there is, in jury instructions, a translation from legalese to try to get everyday language. Second objection is, as she pointed out, translation theory is not a completely coherent field, but she uses translation theory, as she showed, to signal certain possible innovations. For instance, there are certain concerns across the field that are shared, such as the tension between equivalence and function, the politics of voice, which she didn't mention, but I will come to, and the status of the reader. And while these interventions could apply to all jury instructions, she's interested, especially in copyright litigation. It stands out because of the many false cognates. So what we hear, when I hear author, it's different from what a lawyer means by author and originality and so forth. Third objection, what is being translated? We assume what's being translated is the law. And she raises the question, can you actually consider a law a source text? And she says, well, there is an analogy. The law, like a source text, has some semiotic indeterminacy, but it's also not a stable concept. And indeed, also, in some translation theory, your primary focus is not on the source text, but on the reader. We've already talked about reader response criticism, so we're familiar with that. A fourth objection, which she didn't mention, but was in a footnote, what I had, but is one that it's worth talking about, is Sarah says, some people might criticize my text-centric characterization of translation theory, as opposed to, for instance, cultural translation. So I'm going to come back to that. Is it text-centered or is it an act of cultural translation? And then she then did outline this, having outlined how she's going to apply this. She defines two different types of jury instructions, two different directions. The first direction is a version of legal rules, in which I'm using her language here, which is intended to discipline jury decision-making and keep jurors on track, rather like a fence or a set of orange cones on a road. And then the second, which she also mentioned, is more like a technical manual. That's setting up steps to follow, and that is to aid comprehension and simplify legal concepts. That is to guide and assist jurors, rather like a dictionary and perhaps a map. If I have more time, I'd like to deal with all these interesting metaphors in her talk, since metaphor is itself a form of translation. Even though they have two different versions of these instructions, both, she says, have communicative functions. But the first is more disciplining and directive. The second is expressly translational. It bears meaning, or attempts to bear meaning, across to those who might not otherwise have access to it. Now, I tried to then parse this is my own words here. It's just, why do jurors need instructions? Well, presumably, for without them, they would find the original, that's presumably the law, or at least the language of the law, incomprehensible, because it's a technical language. And so instructions discipline them by keeping them on track in order to adhere to the law. Nonetheless, in Roscoe Pound's terms, and this is mine, not from her paper, there is inevitably some jury lawlessness. In other words, either they don't get the instructions or they resist the instructions. I now want to start turning to, from what I can say, just use a couple of phrases that we know about translation to try to focus in on exactly what Zara is saying is being translated in these jury instructions. And I'm going to start with the Italian proverb, traditore, traditore, and that is translator, traitor. And this is a recognition that no matter what you do when you translate, you're never getting it right. And this was especially, in fact, I can't translate that right because part of its sound, once you do it, it's traditore, traditore has that nice sound together. You don't get it in English. And indeed, poetry is long considered to be the most difficult to translate because it involves both sound and sense. And it seems to me what she's focused on here primarily is that jury instructions seem to be concerned almost all with sense, not sound. They aren't worrying about translating sound. They just want to make sure you get the words right. So more appropriate here, and this is a colleague of mine in English, in American literature, who was commenting on Americans' absolute terribleness, even professionals, in knowing foreign languages. So the old thing is, you lose so much in the translation. He said, oh, no, you lose so much in the original, because I couldn't understand the original. I couldn't understand the translation anyway. And it seems to be more that that's it. If the jurors don't have these instructions, they don't can understand the law. And so they would lose it. If they just heard the law, they wouldn't get it. But that said here, this then brings me to the question about moving from the translator to the instructor. I've been both. I've tried to translate for my son, we're overseas, and I'm also an instructor. And I fail in both. I fail miserably. Nonetheless, as a translator, I don't feel I have a disciplinary function. But I do have a disciplinary function when I'm an instructor. And so it seems to me there's a little bit difference here once you start talking about a disciplinary function. So now to some comments here. First comment, I'm going to have 5 comments, questions. Are the two versions of jury instructions that she says really aimed in her language in different directions? Isn't the aid, the guide, designed to keep jurors on track? That is a disciplinary move to make them follow the law. So I see those two directions are actually sort of very much the same. And then this brings me to the question, what does it mean to follow the law? The notion that you follow the law means that to follow something is there's something there to follow. And so that gives me rest of my comments are going to have 2 clusters. One is going to be to raise the possibilities, what are the links, if any, between translation theory and copyright stress on questions having to do with the original? In other words, translation, you have an original and then you have the derivative translation. So are there ways in which we can tease out the similarities there? And the other has to do with what is the source of these instructions. And that raises probably far too pretentious, but this nature of the conference, questions about what are we following when we follow the law. So that brings me then to the next question is, at one time she said, I'm more focused on translation is textual than cultural. I would just like to make the case, I would make an argument that what we're really talking about in jury instructions is a cultural translation. And I would do so because by this argument. that legalese is mastered by a professional group. One of what Peirce would have said is the communities of the competent. Judges need to perform an act of translation for people who speak the same language but do not share the culture of that professional community of which legalese is a part. And so what jurors are being done with these instructors are being disciplined to adhere to the cultural rituals of a particular discipline when they enter into the courtroom. Yes, it is a discipline, but again, the law is a specific type of discipline. Not every discipline, I don't have to follow all disciplines, but I have to follow the law. At least I'm supposed to. So this brings me then to the question of the law as being the source of these instructions. And this was a quotation from the text that I got. The source, Zara said, of instructions is in theory the law. Law students might call this black letter law. Yet she also acknowledges that jury instructions sometimes resist such positivist stability. Well, certainly black letter law is a textual metaphor. What is, though, but is the law a text comprising a set of rules, or is it a set of practices? Indeed, what does it mean to follow the law? And if with Holmes, the legal realist, we might say, if we agree that it's not some brooding omnipresence in the sky, shouldn't we say that law is what the court, including jurors' rulings, decide? Not necessarily. So that is what the law is. And here's just a quick example. One of the most famous jury instructions in American legal history was the famous Justice Lemuel Shaw in the famous Webster murder case. It was at Harvard. Webster was a chemistry professor. He was accused of murdering Parkman, who was a donor to Harvard. Never murder a donor to Harvard. And they found a body in his furnace, in his chemistry lab. But the body was unrecognizable. No DNA testing at that time. And in the charge to the jury, Shaw then told them he changed the standard of proof for corpus delicti from beyond the least doubt to beyond a reasonable doubt. And as a result, they could convict him. This was considered for some judicial murder, but after a while, the charge became the law. And so actually what becomes the law in the jury? So then the question of what is the law being followed returns us back to the question of this following is to the issue of priority, originality, and translation theory and copyright. Now, as I said, the emphasis seems to be in jury instructions on sense, not sound. But in copyright, sound and sense are often linked. For instance, Pope, already quoted, I'm not being original, true wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed. So it's actually a merger of sound and sense, which is what's important there. And that brings me then to the point she didn't raise it orally, but very importantly in the paper, is this question of the politics of voice. And we've been having that discussion all day. So politics of voice, I just want to give an example about how difficult it is to translate voice. And one of the best examples I can think of is when you have foreign films and you have a voice there. You can even dub them or you can subtitle them. And you can subtitle the voice, so you have the original voice, but then you have a text then translating it, or you have a dub voice. And I had the experience, I'm not sure which ones you like, but I sure know which I prefer. I prefer them subtitled, even though popular audiences don't. And I had a wonderful experience once watching the film La Guerre est finie, Yves Montand, wonderful about the Spanish Civil War. They had 3 reels. The first and the third reel were subtitled, the middle was dubbed. And so you got used to it. I didn't understand a thing Yves Montand was saying, but I heard his voice, it was great. And then suddenly I understood the voice, but it was a terrible voice. And so I knew which one I wanted. But more interesting for me about this question, bringing it back to copyright, was when I was there. My German's pretty good. I was in Germany, and I went to see a dubbed version of Sleeper with Woody Allen, if you know that film. And since I had already seen it, I more or less knew it. But there were times, because it was dubbed with a German audience, my German is good, but it's not perfect. And the last thing you learn in the language is to understand jokes. So there were times there I couldn't remember every joke from the English. And everyone was howling in the audience. And I'm sitting there, Jesus Christ, what was that joke? But there was one time when I was howling and everyone was silent. And that was, if you've seen that film, at one time Woody Allen is in a trance. And when he's in a trance, he suddenly becomes Marlon Brando in Streetcar Named Desire. And he does a great job of getting Marlon Brando's voice. But how can you do that in dubbing? And I was laughing and thinking, these poor fools don't know what's going on. Now, the only way to do it was you would have to have the Woody Allen dubber then parodied the voice of the Marlon Brando dubber in German so that the Germans could get it. And that raises the question, I wonder, could a dubber's voice actually be copyrighted? Because it's unique. But anyway, but that's back to the question of the politics of the juror's voice. From a juror's, if not a bad man's point of view, why should I follow jury instructions? Well, presumably because they make him or her follow the law. But as we know, on the one hand, juries were supposed to be part of our great democratic system built into the Constitution. But at the time of Peirce's, the rise of these communities of the competent, jurors were often attacked. Mark Twain attacked them, a lot of important people. Why? Because these jurors were allowing their prejudices to get in the way of the law and therefore distorting the law and justice in our culture. But that is assuming that the law actually leads to justice. And Aristotle reminds us that the law doesn't always lead to justice. And he says because positive law is created by human beings who are always flawed, there are some cases in which following the law doesn't lead to justice, so you need to have the case, of course, you have to have equity. And you have equity, which is a higher law standard. Unfortunately, over in the United States, that doesn't work because equity, of course, is still done by human beings. And and where was equity in the courts of England? They were with the Crown. So in democratic United States, we merge equity with the law. Nonetheless, Roscoe Pound, and back to here, says, in response to all those criticisms of the jury instructors about juries, says, jury lawlessness was actually a democratic, equitable correction to the law from the bottom up. It gave voice to lay people not fully disciplined by the cultural elite of the legal profession. So carnivalesque, I'm not sure what we would call it. So one final thought. If we turn from Benjamin's The Task of the Translator to his Art of the Age of the Mechanical Reproduction, which we are going to get to, we might want to interrogate the role not only of juries but also of copyright law in democracies, and we've been doing that all day. Is, for instance, creating a legally protected class of private property fully democratic in a world in which translations can be better than originals, as in the case of some translations of Poe by Benjamin's beloved Baudelaire, as already referenced? Thank you.
Perhaps you'd like to respond to
I'd love to.
couple of
Gosh,
points?
that was so much fun and such smart and interesting engagement. So thank you. I can't possibly respond to all of it, and I'd love those slides after. They've given me lots of great provocations. So I'm going to take three quick things. The title, it is an allusion to Benjamin, and in the version that I now have, I have a little section kind of reading that. We were talking earlier about the classics and how the legal academy, treats the humanities and outside disciplines sometimes as like a butterfly pinned, like saves it forever. And so this is like the Led Zeppelin of articles on translation theory. So it's kind of dated, but it is a good article, and it's thoughtful for causing you to think about a variety of things, including change over time and how translations can be more nimble than an original, which is a funny thing when you start to think about the translation as being the sort of superior. I mean, which is the original and which is the derivative, right, to your point. And there's more that I could say about that, but I think I'll hold off. You asked me about the relationship between copyright and translation and thinking about originality and authorship. And I've been thinking about this a lot, and it's an area I'd like to go read more in. But as an amateur in this particular area, I know that the rise of the profession of translation sort of coming out of a philological tradition and then imitation by way of some of the things that Simon was talking about. Translation as a thing that was creative and that poets did began around the time that copyright was starting to find its way into litigation, or legislation rather. So if you think about the origins of some notion of translation and some notion of copyright happening around the same time, there is probably a really interesting intellectual history that maps those two out, and maybe you know of one that's already done that. Some of the people in the room may have looked at that, but I do think that there is something there. Juror resistance is a section. I'll say nullification, then I'll explain what I mean by that. But is a part of the project that I talk about a lot. I'm also writing an article just on jury instructions, sort of more generally, not about the translation. And there I think I've been trying to find the right word, because nullification is something that some scholars claim could never happen in the civil context. It can only happen in the criminal, and so I just don't want to use a contested term. But disobedience is not quite right either. It feels to me like there's some moral impulse that's like a resistance, and we don't always know when it's happening. But I think in copyright it happens on the basis of some of the verdicts that we have that aren't explained and that feel and that get described as though they reflect moral rights or plagiarism type charges, where there's a misperception about what we actually protect in the United States and a misunderstanding of the utilitarian scope of copyright. And I'm imagining that this would be a helpful framing for thinking about when they're departing from various kinds of verdicts. Whereas the law is a huge question, and I'm struggling, as you can see from that footnote where I buried one part of it, to figure out how I talk about that, right? I think you're right. I'm interested in the larger ecosystem or sociology of these instructions, and I still can't figure out why there hasn't been more systematic work connecting the pieces of them, and maybe it's partly that it's a hard thing to figure out. I know if you talk to litigators, many of them will just say, well, that's the law. I mean, when I look for what I'm going to present, it's the charge, the pattern instructions, that's the law, and yet it's obviously a bigger question than that, so let's just start.
So again, I'm going to exercise my prerogative and throw out a first question here, which is I want to go back to something that Brooke raised and push you a little bit on this question about textual translation versus cultural translation, right? Because you mentioned there's this small literature on genre theory and jury instructions, right? And since the sort of current trope or crystallization of genre theory is typified social action, it's really, as he was saying, about communities, right? So we have these text jury instructions that are in copyright. We've got model jury instructions that are drafted either by a circuit executive's office or by the judicial conference, right? So they're drafted by lawyers. They're then proposed jury instructions are given to the court, and that eventually is read to the judge in this sort of ritual. Is that almost an initiation, right? I mean, you're somehow trying to bring the jury into the community of, in your case, copyright lawyers, right? And so it may be that the text, as text, doesn't actually matter that much. It's more about being part of the community or understanding the sociality or the expectations or norms of the copyright community.
Yeah, sure. So there's a boring version of an answer to this question, which is like it varies by jurisdiction whether there's any flexibility. So let's assume we're in a jurisdiction where it's an interesting answer, where you can actually depart from one map that you have to simply use. But in the cases where there's some flexibility, right, most jurisdictions start with a text. And the text has been, as you say, drafted by multiple authors or by committee, and sometimes redrafted, and really is a palimpsest in some ways. And one of the reasons I like the title Instructor in the singular is because it's then passed off as though, to the jury, as though it's the judge's words, like there's a single sort of, it gets shrunk into one from the multiple. And then the question of its textuality versus sort of cultural dimensions and how it lands with the jury partly depends on how they receive it. And in some jurisdictions, I'm sorry I keep saying that, but there really is a lot of variation. There are rules permitting jurors to have a copy, but in some there aren't, and they just have to hear it orally. Now the ones like Oracle v. Google or Blurred Lines, where it's 90 to 100 pages, they're typically given a copy, but then even there's a variation between one copy for 12 jurors, and they have to pass it around, and they're diagramming and trying to share information, or one copy, one juror. And then I think it really does start to feel like a text that they can read and mark up. But you're right that it's a text that it's embedded in a lot of things. So I think I've oversimplified in some ways the textuality of it, and you're both causing me to think that I need to talk about it more broadly.
Okay. Lots of... Brooke, you want to jump in? Okay. Okay, Laura Heyman.
So I
always want to respond, but
So actually, I wanted to ask a question about the question of a text, and I'm wondering whether there are different implications for the theory based on this question of translation that leads to a narrative and translation in the sort of lexicography sense. And so this is what I mean by this. The instructions are sort of given, they're atomized in a sense, right? So they're given to jurors. So, you know, here an author is defined as blah, blah, blah. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here. And then there's an instruction on substantial similarity. And this instruction, the judge isn't, in giving these, sort of creating a narrative, isn't linking these up together really, or at least my perception of it, isn't linking them all together in sort of a cohesive narrative, right? The jurors are really taking those and then putting them sort of all together to kind of apply those as a whole to the case. So it's interesting to me to think about sort of how the theory might work differently if we're thinking of translation in terms of a narrative whole versus, like I said, translation in almost a lexicography sense, where it's like, so here, you know, we need a definition for this term, here's a definition. We need a definition for this term, here's a definition, and then the user of all those puts them together into a narrative.
Go ahead, yeah.
I think she, in some ways, in her talk, not in the paper I have, but this question of parts and wholes in translation, which is in translation theory. So your lexica is that's an individual part, but then to put it all together as a whole. So I think that's a very useful realm. Who is putting it together? You would have a much more disciplining type of jury instruction if the judge is putting it all together, or allowing the reader or the individual jurors to do so. On that, in terms of those individual terms, one point I think is important to point out for me in terms of maybe something different in jury instructions and translation, but both having to do with sound, is yes, you're telling the juror, author doesn't mean this, or originality doesn't mean this, it means, in the law it means this. And you need to think of it only in this way. But that's sort of like when some good, savvy lawyer in a trial comes up and at crucial moments knows he's going to be called out of order, but raises a point, and then the judge says, now disregard what he just said. But of course you've already heard it. And so one of the reasons you have jury lawlessness in copyright cases is because those false cognates, you can never get them out of someone's mind, despite all that. And so, and that's an unintentional realm, but maybe sometimes the jurors actually intentionally bring their own meanings to bear. So that gets back to questions. But I think that gets to the lexicographical, how much can you really enforce that on juries?
I do think that there are, yeah, and that's a helpful response partly to your question too from before about disciplining versus guiding. I think the disciplinary issues tend to be evidentiary quite clearly, like you're not allowed to consider this, you're not, and in fact, you're not allowed to use the computer, you're not allowed to do this or that, take notes and so forth, and there are actually rules versus sort of some of the substantive things. I mean, that's a partial answer, but so to your point, Laura, I think there are both. I'm thinking of a case. I've read a bunch of these cases where I read them to know if I'm going to go back to them. You know, I've got these stacks, and so I can't remember the name of this case, but these jurors spent a really long time figuring out what was infringing and what wasn't, and resolved a whole set of questions, and were found to have done so properly and no problems, with one issue, which was whether there was virtual identity in these 7 works, and they had been reasonable in every other respect. But on these 7 works, which they found virtual identity, having been instructed on what virtual identity meant, the judge was just like, they're not virtually identical in any sense of the word, certainly not in the copyright sense, but not even in the, and that's a place where like the words were a problem, but I think that the narrative translation does also happen through the instructions. And in some cases it'll be where the judge is talking to the jurors about their role, thanking them for their time, there's sort of a story there, or explaining how you draw inferences by looking at wet pavement and understanding what circumstantial evidence, so talking in a particular way, and there's kind of a role playing. But then if you abstract out from that, I think there's also a role that translation is playing in the larger narrative of the trial. Maybe that's cheating, I don't know, but it's happening on all those levels, I think.
That's yours.
Thanks. This is extremely thought-provoking and exciting, and I'm really interested to see where it goes. And one of the places that it goes for me instantly is it leaves copyright law really fast. Copyright is certainly full of calcs, as is patent law, maybe even more so. And I think law in general is, although I understand why copyright law is the focus of this paper. So my question is not why copyright, because I think you've heard that question 20 times. My question, though, is as soon as I back away from copyright law, I see a bigger structural question that I want you to address, and that is, there are two theories about why people go to law school, or what the value of a legal education is. One is it teaches you to think like a lawyer, and the other is it teaches you a lot of jargon. And these strike me as really different translational problems, each of which is a translational problem that a jury instruction must accomplish. And one is to translate rules into analytical structures, or to translate words into processes. And jury instructions do that by saying sort of, if you find X, then move on to the next question. Which is often very counterintuitive for the jurors who walk in, and we find new trials ordered all the time because they found internally inconsistent things. The other problem is translating one jargon-filled language into something that people are more likely to understand in their everyday terms, which is a different kind of translation problem. And you seem more focused on the second, but I actually think the first may be as dramatic, particularly when it comes to copyright law, where we have the same word meaning different things at different times in the process. When we use similarity in the context of access and similarity, it means something different from when we use similarity in the context of substantial similarity. And so the analytical process is part of the problem there. And I sort of wonder whether that's factored into your thinking or how you factor that into your thinking.
Wait, can you give me like a 6-word version of your question so I know what to answer? Because that was it was a super interesting, helpful.
Is it analytical or is it lexical?
All right. Yeah, it's definitely
or both.
Well, and it's definitely both, and it's definitely both, right? I'm trying to remember who made the point about the word fair in fair use.
Oh, I was Laura too. She's good at this.
Yeah. Well, there were tons of points that you were making during your talk that I was noting down. But sorry, I think it's both. I mean, I think there are intuitions that are really good for juries to work from, and that's really the role that juries should have. And when we put them into a place where they're supposed to be working from concepts that are translated, it's a little bit like, you know, why if you're in comp lit, they tell you can't go anywhere in comp lit unless you can read in the original, right? Like at a certain point, if you want a professional level experience of something, you need both the language and the knowledge within, and you have to try to learn it from within. So let's have the right role for the jury. You know, I think I'm not doubling down, certainly not here, on the idea that copyright is unique, and I'm completely ready in the other paper to face that as a critique, and I'm not even sure I'm doubling down on it. But my intuition is that copyright, unlike many other areas, has at its heart a metaphysical and epistemological problem around figuring out whether something's infringing or wrongful, that courts are in a hopeless muddle about. Everybody knows that, and it's been that way for half a century. And scholars have only in the recent 5-10 years started to try to give a framework that could help get out of it. So in that sense, I think that it's a bigger problem, and the instructions reflect and encode that muddle, that confusion. I don't know if Brooke wants to weigh in.
Just a quick comment. From the outside, I have never gone to law school and don't plan to at the moment. It does seem to me that your two differences, thinking like a lawyer and learning a jargon, how can you think like a lawyer without learning the jargon? They seem to me, in other words, that's sort of implying that a language can be separate from thinking. But the whole point there is that that's a very form of thinking. So anyway. And that gets us back to translation theory, and that why translation is so difficult, because when you're in a particular language, it leads to certain types of thought that you can't have in another language.
We're accepting applications right now, Brooke.
Okay, can I get a tuition waiver? All right.
we have some scholarships for extraordinary students. We might be able to fit in one more quick question, or are people ready to go for a break? Okay, so let's thank the panel for a great presentation. Again, we will be back at in about 15 minutes at 1:45 for those of you who are viewing remotely, and for those of you who are here in the building, again, there's some coffee and other viands just around the corner.